Okay, guys, for numbers 15 through 19 in your review, excuse me, the instructions ask you to factor each expression and then multiply to check your work. I'm going to let you do the checking on your own. I'm going to do the factoring. What I do want to remind you of, though, is that these are expressions. There are no equal signs here. That means that you are simply going to factor them and you're going to move on to the next problem. You're not setting any of the factors equal to zero because there is no equal sign. Okay? So for number 15, excuse me, in order to factor number 15, you're going to look at the problem and you're going to say to yourself, what do each of these terms have in common? In other words, what number and or variable can divide into each of these terms? So I look at them, and for the numbers, I see that 8 can be divided into both of the numbers, and for the variables, x can be divided into them. So I'm going to be dividing both terms by 8x, so I'm factoring out 8x. Well, remember I told you in class, if you are trying to factor something, basically you just divide it. So you're going to be dividing 8x from this term and this term. Now, when I divide my first term by 8x, I'll be left with 4x. My second term, when I divide it by 8x, all I have is 1. So the answer for this one is 8x times 4x plus 1, and there is nothing more you can do with that problem. So like I told you a minute ago, since there is no equal sign, you're not setting these factors equal to 0. You're going to move on to the next problem. So number 16. For number 16, I have 18x squared minus 8. Now I see a minus sign there, so immediately I start thinking to myself, might that be a difference of squares? Well, right now it's definitely not a difference of squares because I don't have a perfect square minus another perfect square. However, I do have a greatest common factor. So if there is some number that can divide into both of those terms, you have to factor that out first. So I know that 2 can divide into the 18 and into the 8, so I'm going to factor it out first. So I'm factoring out a 2. Remember I said that's the same as division. So you divide each term by the 2. So the first term divided by 2 will be 9x squared minus the 8 divided by 2 is 4. Now that I factored out a 2, I do have a difference of squares. And remember, with the difference of squares, you have a perfect square minus another perfect square. This 9x squared is a perfect square. 4 is another perfect square, and they're being subtracted. So if you remember, these are going to factor the same way every time. So you have to bring your 2 down. And then the square root of the first term will be 3x. That goes here and here. The square root of your second term is 2. That goes here and here. And because this is a minus, remember you're going to have two different signs. One is a plus, one is a minus. So your answer would be 2 times 3x plus 2 times 3x minus 2. Now, number 17. This is one of those problems that we just kind of went over very quickly in class the other day. And this is a sum of squares. Now, we didn't do practice problems on this one, but it is going to factor similar to the difference of squares that we had in number 16. The only difference is because when I factor this, I can't multiply. Well, let me go back. This is a sum of squares, so we're going to factor it very similar to the other. But the difference is it's going to be x here and here, because that's the square root of the first term. You're still going to take the square root of that second term, which will be a 10. But because I don't want a middle term, I'm going to have I here. So it'll be x plus 10i, x minus 10i. And if you needed to check your work on that one, this one I will check with you because I want you to understand where this came from. This is the answer to the problem. But we're going to FOIL it back out just to check and see why it works. So if I FOIL, I'm going to have x times x, which will be x squared. First times last, so it'll be x times this negative 10i will be negative 10xi. Then for these two middle terms, 10i times a positive 10i times x will be plus 10xi. And then for the last term times the last, that would be a negative 100 I squared. Now, the two middle terms are going to cancel out, which will leave you with x squared minus 100 I squared. But if you remember, what is I squared? It's negative 1. So you have x squared minus 100 times negative 1, which becomes a plus 100. So when you have to factor a sum of two squares, always remember you're going to factor it using the same basic pattern as the difference of squares, but you have to include the I, because that's the only way that those middle terms are going to cancel out and you'll be able to get your plus sign in the middle. Okay, hopefully that helps you. Now for number 18, 18 is very basic. You have a leading coefficient of a 1, and so you start thinking to yourself, can you multiply? Can you find two numbers that will multiply to give you a negative 54, but add to give you a positive 3? The answer to the question is yes, you can, and that will factor to be x here and here. And if you use the x method, you would have your negative 54 on top, and then your positive 3 on the bottom. The numbers that you would use would be a positive 9 and a negative 6. So that's going to be x plus 9 here, x minus 6 here. And that's your answer. Okay, let's go to the next one. So number 19 is the last one of these in the factoring section. So we have 7x squared plus 5x minus 2. Now the problem here is that the leading coefficient is not a 1, so this is not going to be one of those that you can factor easily like number 18. So what I want you to do on this one is remember what we did in class. I taught you how to do it using the window method. So I'm going to factor it with the window method. And no, you cannot use the quadratic formula here because there is no equal sign. So you can't use the quadratic formula and you can't complete the square. You only can factor it. So your leading coefficient, or your first term, goes here. 7x squared goes in the first box. Negative 2 goes in the last box. At this point, remember I told you you're going to multiply those. So 7x squared times negative 2 is negative 14x squared. Now we're looking for two numbers that will multiply to equal a negative 14x squared, but add together to equal the middle term, which is a positive 5x. So that's going to be a positive 7x and a negative 2x. So if I put those in the box, it doesn't matter which box you put them in. Positive 7x, negative 2x. Now remember, you go across each row and down each column looking for the greatest common factor. So for this first row right here, you're going to look for your greatest common factor, which is a single x. And the second row, your greatest common factor is 1. Now, we go down the columns looking for the greatest common factor. The greatest common factor for this column is 7x. And then on the second column, greatest common factor is a negative 2. So we're almost done. Your factors are going to be 7x minus 2 times x plus 1. And that's your answer.